Brandon, what was it like in the good old days of ye old 2008?
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. I haven't lived out here 20 years, and then just to watch in my neighborhood alone, bought a house at like a quarter of the prices that they're going for now. So yeah, it's been a remarkable time.
And how old were you when you bought that home?
Somewhere in my 20s.
You're just rubbing it in at this point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember being in the governor's office and traveling around to different schools, and we had a slide deck that would really just sell Arizona, and that was one of the main points, was median home prices out here and the opportunity in your 20s and 30s to buy a home.
I hate you.
Yeah,
I'll
sorry
never
about
be
that.
able to afford a home at these prices. As an apartment dweller, I'm extremely jealous. Yeah, that's not the reality anymore. No, certainly not. But it's so interesting to see. We've looked a lot into the price of homes and the property tax, because obviously counties care a lot about it. And those lines don't match at all. And so that's what we wanted to talk about today, how home prices and the property tax that you pay on that same house, they don't have a lot to do with each other in Arizona, at least not compared to other states. So let's get into it. So welcome to Off the Charts, the Creatures of Statute series, where we dig into the data and get to tell the stories that most people and most policymakers don't get to see. I'm Vanessa Fielder, joined by Brandon Nee and Zoe Averill, and today we're going to dig into home prices and why they don't necessarily track with the property taxes that you're paying to fund essential government services. All right, so property taxes, definitely something that the average Arizonan doesn't enjoy paying. I'm with you, but it's a really interesting, transparent tax, right? Where I get a notice of value from the assessor and I can see how much is going to my school district, how much is going to fund my county government, my city government, and then I get to vote on all sorts of stuff. But just because it's transparent doesn't mean that people like it. And so we spend a lot of our time talking about property taxes.
Yeah, and it's a huge component of the county's major general fund revenue streams, right? I mean, it funds a ton of essential services.
I think it's like 40% of all county general funds come from the property tax.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
It's also the tax that we collect that's most direct to our constituents and our voters. Right? We share a lot of these other ones with tourists, people that drive through, commerce. But this is a conversation directly with people who own here, live here, and are voting for our elected officials.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we put together a lot of resources for supervisors and policymakers to understand the property tax system. So I'm just going to pull that up. It's through our budget and tax portion on our research website. And this study that we did has a lot of good insights into kind of why we don't have the same types of just massively increasing property tax levies that we've heard about across the country.
Yeah, I certainly remember the base, both in Ohio and in Georgia, being dramatically higher for homes that were much cheaper than what I've seen here.
Yeah, we were talking about before that the property value that I have on my house that I pay taxes on has no resemblance to the market value that I could get for my house if I sold it tomorrow.
Right. And that's by design, right? That's a structural component of what we're talking about and why these two lines don't necessarily match here in Arizona.
So let's look at the data. So we did a 10-year look back on kind of the overall primary property tax levy that the counties have collected and how much that's grown. And so this is the stuff that funds like the sheriff's office, the criminal justice system, the courts,
The assessor, the treasurer.
the other constitutional officers. And over the last decade, those levies have grown by about 44%.
Yeah, 44% over this time period sounds reasonable. How does that compare to what home prices have actually done?
I mean, the contrast between these lines is kind of bonkers. So for folks that can't see the chart, primary levy is kind of linear, right? It just goes up a little bit each year, 44% over the whole time period. The housing line looks almost like a stretched out S, where it's just kind of linear, then a straight up line, and then linear again. Overall, we're looking at 113% growth.
Yeah, there's a couple of shapes in that blue line that are interesting. Obviously, there's the most dramatic thing is that 2 or 3 year growth period in the middle that just recalibrated the sort of trend line before and after. But even the before and after trend line looks like it's more dramatic or rising quicker than the underlying levy.
You can see, really hear the difference between the taxable value of your home and also just the market value of your home, right? If it's rising by 113% versus the property tax levy rising at 44%, there's really a difference in structure here.
Yeah. And I think we'd like to take credit for that, right? Boards don't generally like to increase property tax levies. So that's definitely one thing that's holding that levy line down. But those structural components that you talked about, Zoe, are really the thing that's preventing property taxes from tracking with home prices, and it's by design. The one that I think is probably the most influential was Prop 117. And of course, I have a chart for this, and it looks weirdly similar to the chart that we've got up on the screen right now. But if we look at the limits on the property tax in Arizona, we can kind of understand a little bit better why this is happening, not just that it's happening. Yeah, that chart basically looks the same. And what it's looking at is full cash value versus limited property value. And those are just the words that we use in the property tax system to describe the market value of your home, which just goes up with the price that you could sell it for, and the taxable value of your home, which voters have determined cannot go up by more than 5% per year.
Wow. Yeah. So that taxable value is capped. So there's a protection on that front for the homeowner. But then there are other protections as well. I mean, there's a cap on how much the county can actually bring in terms of its levy every year.
Yeah. So the levy limit's another and totally distinct mechanism that home prices don't really factor into. So a county's limit is really just based on what their limit was last year plus 2% and the value of like new stuff being built. So new businesses coming into the community, new homes coming online. And so that really strict limitation also puts a lot of downward pressure on what a county can levy on the property tax. So if we map county levy limits on this chart too, it basically tracks what the aggregate primary levy is.
Yeah, wow. You can see that the homeowner is protected on those two fronts, right? Their taxable value can only increase at about 5% per year. And then the levy is only able to grow at 2% plus new construction. And so you can see that, you know, we're growing at 4% a year in terms of their levy, but everything that the county is buying is getting more expensive. Do you have inflation?
Yeah. Let me add that. Yeah, so inflation has basically washed out all of the purchasing power of the primary levy. It's up by 42% compared to the actual levy up 44%.
So the growth in county levy has essentially been consumed by inflation.
Yeah, they're just treading water. Their purchasing power is the same as it was 10 years ago, at least on the property tax side. Inflation isn't the only cost driver that counties have to deal with, right? There's other state mandates that come into the system that also have nothing to do with the restrictions that are placed on the property tax. But the only way for a county to pay for those mandates, if they're not seeing sales tax growth, is to toggle the property tax levy. So I've got Altex here.
Yeah, wow. You can really see the growth in Altex, which is the long-term care system that counties are required to pay into. That's a huge cost driver for counties who have zero control over the eligibility requirements of the program or kind of cost growth in the program whatsoever. They're just payers, not policymakers, into this kind of mandated cost.
Yeah, and it can have a really dramatic and volatile effect on county budgets, right? Like I think back to Graham last year. That's a county with like 30,000 people, a pretty weak property tax base, and their Altex payment increased by 45% in a single year.
That's completely unmanageable.
It's interesting that we're seeing a cost and a revenue on the same screen. And in one sense, we're seeing a cost that we're allowing to sort of grow with population growth, economic activity, when we're so obviously constraining the revenue side of that from all of the taking the full effect of the same impact.
So it has to be a balance, right? From a policy standpoint, we have to think about, all right, the voters have decided to put these limitations on how much they want to pay on the property tax. Totally makes sense, and it's their prerogative, right? That structure exists in the Constitution for a reason. But from a practical implementation side, we also have to think about, well, if costs are also growing outside of the county's control and they don't have the ability to recoup it, a lot of pressure can exist and create a real tight operating environment for local governments to be able to deliver the services that constituents want, right? Like most people want safe communities. Counties deliver that. Most people want an efficient court system. Counties have to fund that.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the squeeze that counties are feeling, but it's worth asking. I mean, are counties able to toggle the property tax lever? Are most counties up against their limit? Do we have data to look at that?
Yeah, because this chart, right, that we looked at before showed the levy and the levy limit tracking pretty similarly, but I don't think that's the same across all 15 counties. And if there's one thing we don't really like to do at CSA, it's aggregate the counties all together. All right, so let me pull up these levy limits on a county by county basis. I'm going to go into the encyclopedia because it's the easiest way to kind of see this as a snapshot in the revenue section. I'm just going to go to the property tax page that shows all 15 counties. All right, let me zoom in here because it's just one of these charts that we're interested in that shows the county's levy expressed as kind of a share of their levy limit. So if you're at 100%, your levy and your limit are the same. If you're anywhere under 100%, you could be collecting more in property tax revenue is kind of the way to think about it. You might not want to, right? The board's obviously making a decision there. Kind of to your point, Zoe, about there's a policy choice being made at the local level, right, to not levy something on the property tax, but it's not always a choice, right? Who are the counties that are at the levy limit on here?
I mean, yeah, you see Apache, Coconino, La Paz, Graham, Navajo, Yuma. I mean, a bunch of rural counties here all up against that levy limit. So they have no unused capacity. That squeeze, it's not a choice, right?
Yeah, they're just kind of there. I mean, Apache and Coconino are super interesting, right? Because their levy limits are really low, like under $1 on the property tax rate. And the maximum amount that like a homeowner is going to pay on their property tax is $10 to give folks some context. And I think Coconino's might even be less than 50 cents. Yeah, it's 48 cents is their levy limit as a property tax rate in the current fiscal year.
Yeah, so what does that tell you?
So what that tells me is if Coconino sees a big alt-tax spike, if Coconino sees constituents asking for investment in certain types of services, they can't go to the property tax to do that. So they've got to rely on just growth in their other revenues because the county doesn't have the authority to just go levy another sales tax like a municipality might or like the state could do theoretically if they wanted to. It's literally not an option for the county. So they've either got to find the money somewhere else in the budget to deal with an additional cost driver or hope that there's growth in things like state shared TPT.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning there is a statutory mechanism for counties to ask the voters to raise their levy limit, but it's also worth noting that that's only on a temporary basis. And to our knowledge, it's rarely used.
Yeah, the counties don't like to rely on the property tax. And because it's only a temporary solution, right? If you're looking at structural ongoing increases in your costs, it's not really a good option for fiscal management over the long term.
So Zoe, you said earlier the ones near the top here you characterize as some of our rural counties. We certainly, by looking at this list, can tell that there's some of the ones that don't see the same performance in some of the other revenue categories that we see in urban areas.
Yeah, so it means that they have to be a lot more reliant on the property tax base as a result. Yeah, so Zoe, you mentioned it's not really common for counties to go out for these levy limit overrides on a temporary basis. You looked into this a lot last year. Can you give us a sense of if the pressure that those like 5 to 7 counties seem to be feeling on the levy limit is relatively recent, or is this kind of a structural issue that we've seen over the long term?
Yeah, the history is kind of wild when you look at it over the long term. So if you pull up kind of that scatter plot that I developed last year, this is a chart that shows each county's levy limit utilization over time from when these were established back in 1980 through fiscal 25. And, you know, kind of on the left side of this chart in 1980 onward through to the early 2000s, you can really see kind of the difference in each county and how much of their levy limit they were actually utilizing. So you see this broad swath, right? You've got counties at 40, 50, 60%, others that are closer to their levy limit. And so it was sort of a choice for them to levy under their levy limit, right? They had that unused tax capacity that they could potentially, you know, go and utilize. But then you see this, you know, huge constraint in 2008 due to a kind of a constitutional referral that was put into place in 2006 that said, okay, if whatever levy you were utilizing, counties, that's now your 100% overnight, right? So if you were at 60% of your levy limit, that's now your new base. That's what your 100%. And so you see that kind of constriction. All of the counties were now bumping up against their levy limit.
It's really cool to be able to see something so dramatic as that, the impact of that referral that you're talking about. And it seems like such a punitive penalty for those who managed to a lesser utilization to just be so directly then harmed with this sort of great reset that happened.
And it's amazing. We see that constriction in 2008, right? And so counties aren't able to, you know, build any sort of extra capacity on the property tax. And then we see the Great Recession.
Yeah, certainly the timing of that referral couldn't have been any poorer.
Yeah, so that timing issue created a lot of challenges, right? This recession hit Arizona particularly hard, and it's a result of this tension that we have, right, between wanting to protect the property taxpayer and ensuring that we have enough resources to fund the services that the constituents in Arizona need and want, right?
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about that balance here in Arizona and then you kind of bring it into that more national context. How do we stack up compared to other states when it comes to the property tax?
Yeah, let's zoom out. The Tax Foundation does a really nice job kind of on an annual basis looking at the relative property tax burden for homeowners across the country. So let me pull up their most recent report. So they've got kind of an interesting way of doing this. They look at the value of homes in a state or a county, and then they look at kind of what the property tax burden is as a share of that value to give us kind of a normalized distribution so we can apples to apples compare Arizona to all of the other states in the country. And what we see, this map has a lot of really light states where the property tax burden isn't that high, and then a lot of really dark states where the property tax burden is obviously a lot bigger. And Arizona is solidly in that light category.
We're like 47th or 48th, depending on the year.
Yeah. And the relative burden is pretty low. They have an effective tax rate here in Arizona of less than 0.5% versus, our kind of southwestern neighbors in Texas at about 1.5%.
Wow.
And then kind of traditionally property tax burdensome states like Illinois at almost 2% of an effective tax rate.
This definitely maps to my experience in the Midwest and Southeast, for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about it. The legislature, I think, focuses so much on property tax in order to help promote affordability. But when we already rank amongst the lowest, it's just there's kind of a disconnect there between what's actually driving affordability. It's not the property tax, as we've kind of discussed. It's other factors like home prices and economic factors.
Absolutely. So it's super interesting from like a policymaking standpoint to think about how that tension we talked about between protecting homeowners and ensuring that we've got enough resources for government services has played out in Arizona. And obviously, it's to the protection of the homeowner. And you can see that in how low of a property tax burden we have here. And so when we see those two lines diverging, right, between home prices at 113% growth and levy limits at 44% growth, that's on purpose, right? That's kind of the nature of the system that voters and policymakers have decided to design, but it has real structural consequences at the local level when we've got cost drivers that are outpacing our ability to generate revenue.
Yeah, it seems like local governments are under more pressure than the system is designed to sort of handle.
Yeah, and that's something that we just have to have an open conversation about. And it's helpful to understand kind of each local county's narrative. So dig into the data, kind of see where your county is relative to its levy limit, how that's compared historically. You can find all the data that we covered today at countysupervisors.org/data, or if you're interested in the study Zoe did at countysupervisors.org/levy limits.
Yeah, and we've actually got a great podcast episode on property taxes in Arizona. And so you can listen to that, wherever you get your podcasts.
Get a sense of where your county sits in terms of its property tax, and we'll see you next time on Off the Charts.